Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to get started in just one more minute. Thank you all so much for joining us. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're giving everyone just another moment to sign on. Thank you so much for being on time. Thank you for being here. Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Okay, we'll get started. Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this session on conscious inclusion, strategies for making your workplace more inclusive, more diverse, and more equitable. My name is Allison Weiss, and I'm the Associate Director of Corporate and Executive Education at the Brown School of Professional Studies. Here at the Brown School of Professional Studies, our mission is to empower you with the resources, skills, tools, and network that you need to change the way the world works for good. So many studies show us that we end up spending over 50% of our lives at work, and that the way that we're doing work right now is just not working for the majority of us. We're experiencing unprecedented levels of burnout. We have the most diverse workforce we've ever had, and yet people don't feel included and don't feel a sense of belonging. And there are just so many other ways in which the way the world works is changing, but our professional training isn't keeping up with that. And that is what we are here to do, is to help you fill those gaps, keep your skills up to date, and become those incredible leaders that will change the way the world works for good. And we do that by offering a series of different programs of different sizes, all the way from master's degrees to certificate programs like the Applied DEI Strategies Certificate, which we'll tell you more about at the end, to short programs, to free master classes like the one you're at today, to help you learn in-demand skills in a way that fits into your busy schedules. So we are so excited that you have decided today to learn more about conscious inclusion, which is such a crucial skill for a modern workforce. I encourage you to submit your questions throughout today. Please don't wait until the end to submit questions, because we typically get a lot of questions, and by you sending in your questions as you have them, it helps me to group and to prioritize and get through as many as we can. To submit a question, please click on the bottom bar of your Zoom, click on the Q&A, and type and submit your question there, and I'll be monitoring it throughout. And with that, I am so excited to introduce today's speaker, Jarvis Sam. Jarvis is the professor of the practice at Brown's School of Professional Studies, the CEO and founder of the multi-services diversity, equity, and inclusion firm Rainbow Disruption, and the former Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Nike. He was recently named Forbes 30 Under 30 in Sports class of 2021, as well as Portland Business Journal's 40 Under 40. In addition, he is the developer and the instructor for our Applied DEI Strategies Certificate. So if you love what you learned from him today, and I always learn something from him, we will tell you a little bit at the end about how you could choose to continue your learning journey with him through the Applied DEI Strategies Certificate. So with that, I'll turn things over to you, Jarvis. Welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Allison, for having me. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining our conversation today. I have had such a great pleasure getting to partner with my alma mater, Brown University, on this incredible Applied DEI Strategies Certificate program. Our very first cohort was so wonderful, with students coming from so many varied backgrounds and experiences, coming together to better understand how do we bridge the theoretical with the practical to be able to foster empowering impact connected to how we build programs that thrive, connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion. You see, over the course of the last several years, we've seen such an amplification of how diversity, equity, and inclusion comes to life in its reality and realized experiences in the workplace. And while many organizations have found new and refined ways to ultimately create support systems for people and teams, the infrastructure alone will not do the job. We need empowered and proactive leaders like each and every one of you. Whether you are a part of an ERG group or an employee resource group in your organization, a DEI leader yourself or a part of a DEI team, an HR leader, or just a people manager or interested executive who wants to grow or hone in your skills, It's absolutely imperative that we learn the core tenets for how we build approaches to equity and inclusion that thrive. Today, I'll be giving a very brief lecture on the discussion of conscious inclusion, discussing exactly what it is, what are some barriers or challenges to how we got here, and ultimately, how do we change the game to make stronger impact over time. First and foremost, while a lot of organizations have been able to explore the reality of their journey by understanding the contours of diversity, so much of their work has started or stopped with aims toward representation. You see, for so many organizations, they put in place perspectives on how to better hire through the lens of diversity recruitment. Some leading organizations think about talent management systems and platforms to drive promotion, retention, and development. However, the buck typically stops there. We create these environments where we diversify people and teams within organizations, not realizing that while the beauty of diversity, one often rooted in both ethical principles around doing the right thing and business-focused principles of the impact on revenue generation and profitability, can go a long way. Bringing folks together without giving them the infrastructure for how to navigate and thrive in environments of change and across lines of difference is where we often see challenges happen. So we move into the space of equity. Few organizations actually seek to better understand the essence of equity. You see, the concept or philosophy of equity is one often deemed very different than that of the philosophy of equality. Take, for example, this perspective. I live in Portland, Oregon, and Los Angeles, California these days. And so let's imagine that I go into downtown LA and I have $1,500 to disperse between 3 people. I'm going to give $500 to each of them directly. $500 goes to an individual who actually is a Wall Street banker. She's in town from New York City and has just taken some of her colleagues out to dinner the night before. That dinner exceeded more than double the $500 that I'm giving her, but she takes it anyway. In the second example, I encountered an individual who has been experiencing homelessness for the last 2 years. And this $500 enables them to not only seek refuge and opportunity for pursuing housing, but it allows them to explore career opportunities and seek employment. Or what about the third person who has recently lost a family member? And this $500 is actually the last amount that they need to ensure that their loved one can go in peace. You'll notice in all 3 of these situations, the $500 was used in different ways or different spaces, but I gave them all exactly the same. That's the concept or philosophy of equality. Equity, on the other hand, seeks to understand the different dimensions that each of these individuals needs to be successful and ultimately distributes resources to more effectively assist them. For example, what if just by giving the individual who is experiencing homelessness $750, we're now able to ensure that they have a suit for that job interview, that we can connect them with employment and career services so that they can change and promote an entirely different and better life for their family? What if we were to add an additional $500 to the individual that has recently experienced a loss of life in their family, and this allows them to extend bereavement from their hourly job of employment, enabling them to spend more time with people and family members? You see, equity incentivizes us to think differently about how we engage with different communities and populations of people. For organizations that prioritize equity, they find ways to better manage communities and teams, not by positioning them through massive acronyms like LGBTQIA+ or BIPOC, but rather by considering us through the disaggregated lenses of the work that we need to support the realities of our own experiences. It forces us to consider that the experiences, for example, of white women are different than those of Black trans women. The experiences of cisgendered gay men like myself are different than those experiences of non-binary identified individuals or intersex individuals in our workspaces. Equity enables us to create structures and systems that move beyond programs and initiatives. But even when we've done a really nice job at building approaches to representation and can hopefully keep and retain talent over time, even if we built equitable approaches to our systems and have created the conditions for success, inclusion is often a lost art. and the reality of which we're building. But exactly what is it? Inclusion is oftentimes that felt experience that says if the reality of the celebration, not just tolerance of my diversity, is revealed, can my organization actually support me in meaningful ways that incentivize me to want to be retained within this workplace? Inclusion are those intentional actions that happen throughout an organization that create the conditions where not only trust, but real and apparent psychological safety is felt in the workplace. In research studies done by organizations like Google in 2016, such as their rework study, where they looked at over 400 teams within their organization, they found that commitment to the work, workers seeing value in what they do, organizational structure and clarity are but building blocks. The number one approach that allows for highly successful and high-performing teams is psychological safety, defined as a lack of fear from taking risk and making mistakes without repercussion or retribution for trying to grow the impact of the business. Do you ensure that psychological safety is built and felt within your organization? Do you create the conditions to make sure that all employees have not only the capabilities, but the capacities that they need to promote psychological safety in the workplace? The reality, even with our best efforts and best intent, there are a number of barriers that negatively impact the likelihood that we can build effective approaches to the fostering of conscious inclusion at work. One of those barriers is bias. But don't take my word for it. Take a look at this quick video that explores the impact of some of these types of biases on people's lives and realities.
If a woman exhibits what are considered more masculine behaviors, such as being assertive, speaking out, they're described very differently.
A man in my office felt as though my tone was off-putting and abrasive.
What we found in our work around unconscious gender bias is that women really face a double bind.
I really felt as though it was important to be liked in my job, and so I really took it to heart. And I started to change the way that I spoke to people, but it didn't feel natural. My natural way is to actually be certain and to be confident and to be very clear on what I expect from people.
Damned if you do, doomed if you don't. Unconscious gender biases has a direct link as well to the gender pay gap.
It was 10 or 12 years ago, and I had taken on a couple more accounts, had won a good amount of new business for the office, and it came time for review. And I asked my manager, who was a woman, whether or not I could be looked at for a raise. The response I got was that I was being difficult and that I was asking for more than what I deserved. And I was heartbroken. I was heartbroken. I was already tired because I had a baby at home and I was working really hard. But it was heartbreaking.
For women of color, they face all of these barriers that all women face, but you layer on the complexities and the biases against various race ethnicities.
As a woman and as a woman of color and as an African-American woman, those are three things against me. And when I get in certain rooms, I am invisible. And that is very painful.
What we have found is that unconscious gender bias gets into talent management systems. It impacts career advancement.
In the agency side, I would watch as male counterparts would get promoted or would get included in meetings I wasn't getting included in. You didn't see as many women at the top to emulate or, aspire to.
As you can tell by the very powerful sentiments from Dr. Robinson, Dr. Guo, and Dr. Amber G, the reality is conscious inclusion is when we strategically execute a practical approach to driving thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors. It allows us to value and leverage differences to achieve superior results. So what then is the differentiating factor that promotes impact with conscious inclusion? It is not necessarily a belief in the process of changing hearts and minds, of which people will often tell you the diversity, equity, and inclusion work is all about. On the contrary, it's about changing mindsets and behaviors. as we move along our journey of unawareness and being a bystander to actually productively impacting at the level of advocacy and activism. But as you heard from Dr. Robinson, there are so many different elements that can be inhibiting factors to how we see this, of which we'll walk through 3 quick ones today. In the video, you saw the impact of bias. Next, we'll talk about the implication of identity covering. And finally, the lack of effective cultural humility. First and foremost, bias plays out in so many ways in our organizations. The statistics, science, and research are clear. We consume 11 million bits of information every single second. And yet, folks, we only consciously process about 40 of those bits. What's more, 2% of our emotional cognition is processed through our conscious mind. What happens to the rest of it? We leverage our subconscious and our unconscious to process it. But in an attempt to take a mental shortcut, think about if you're driving down the street and you're using a GPS, but you know a faster way to get there based on your previous experience. You're going to take some shortcuts. What happens, though, if down one of those shortcuts is a construction zone, actually making your commute much larger? This is exactly what happens with our brains. When we rely on mental shortcuts that are often rooted in stereotype, it can create mental bugs or construction type obstacles in our way to be able to see the realities of people's experiences. As people, we are all biased. So it's not to argue that bias itself is inherently a bad thing. It's the impact and implication of what happens with that bias that can prove quite challenging. Throughout my life and experience, one of the pieces that I am such an aficionado of and have an affinity toward are safaris. So I try to carve out time every year to go do a bit of volunteer work in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa. But while I'm in the region, I also go on safari. Bias is rooted in that same fight or flight response to where if that lion gets a little too close to my Jeep, I'm out of there. I often tell people you don't have to necessarily be the fastest runner, just faster than the slowest one. And yet we apply this same principle of the fight or flight response to how we engage in the workplace. And it impacts things like selection, expectation, and team dynamics. Take things like likability bias, for example. You saw that play out in the video that I just showed. Women are said to walk a proverbial tightrope in the workplace, where on the one side, if she's too kind, mild, meek, or eager, she's not seen as equipped or ready for moments of leadership. Oftentimes, we see coded language like she lacks executive presence as a means to deny her opportunities for advancement. On the flip side, if she demonstrates the exact same qualities and characteristics as her male counterparts, she might be dubbed as abrasive, or aggressive. Here's the impact of that. Lean In did a research study in 2016 where they found that in overwhelming amounts of cases, 66% of women often receive performance feedback based on her personality, whereas only 1% of her male counterparts receive any kind of feedback based on his personality. This is because we choose to apply certain elements of attribution or performance bias, and every time that we do this, it impacts the likelihood for her to succeed in the workplace, creating some pretty significant challenges around the impact of bias. When bias enters our people processes, it makes it that much more difficult for us to try to thrive toward the impact of conscious inclusion. Second, the impact of identity covering. Dr. Robinson describes her experiences of not only being a woman, but a woman of color, and more specifically, a Black woman. She speaks of it through the lens of saying it's 3 strikes against her. But what does she mean by that? When we consider the literature on topics like intersectionality and identity covering, we quickly discover that the implications that those that find themselves at multiple levels of exclusion face can be quite challenging. Take, for example, the pay gap. When we look at research done in 2020 by the National Women's Law Center, they discovered that while on average, women make 82 cents to every $1 earned by her white and male counterparts, Black women only make 63 cents. Native American women, 60 cents, and Latina women, a staggering 55 cents to every $1 that's earned. When we don't consider the multiple dimensions or the realities of her experience, we can never create inclusive environments in the workplace that are meant to serve her and to show up to positively impact her experience. What's worse, is so many folks then look to identity covering as a means to try to get around or sidestep some of these challenges that they experience at work. For many of you, the term identity covering might be a new word for you, but here's the definition of it. It is the downplaying or modifying of an element of our existence simply to fit into the workplace. We focus on things like acceptance, the creation of psychological and physical safety, assets, and creating of opportunities. Yet, while the impact of covering tends to be a personal choice, the reality is so much bigger. When we have to cover at work and create a version of ourselves that exists in the workplace vis-a-vis a version that exists outside of the workplace, we often find this impacting the likelihood of creating a sense of belonging, psychological safety, or our ability to retain talent. You see, we see this play out in a number of ways. One of the areas of covering that I like to talk to people about is appearance-based covering. It's where we literally change an element of our appearance just to fit in. Do you realize that in 27 US states, more than half of our nation, it is still legal to fire or not hire somebody because of the color or texture of their hair? Folks, I literally have 40-inch rainbow locks in my hair. I would probably be fired from the majority of jobs that I would seek or desire to take on. The impact of hair discrimination, though, is so troubling because not only is it pervasive in workplaces, it also impacts our school and academic systems as well. What ends up happening is people, particularly Black women, feel the need to chemically alter or chemically straighten their hair just to fit into the professional standards of what is deemed as holding that executive presence. This causes a significant amount of both physical harm and psychological trauma to that experience, meaning that the impact of covering impacts her life and reality so much more. Research done by Deloitte and Dr. Kenji Yoshino have continued to discover that 61% of all of our employees cover in one form, fashion, or another. This is an inherent blocker to our ability to promote conscious inclusion at work. And so then we have to turn to the third and final point, cultural humility. Oftentimes in our workplaces, we find it very difficult to say things like, I don't know, I'm unsure, I'm uncertain. And it's largely because the ethos of corporate America has so often conditioned us to believe that those terms on their own are a sign of weakness. Whereas when it comes to the navigation of topics like identity and people's comfortability in bringing their fullest selves to the workplace, those are a very necessary prerequisite to how we build the conditions that allow people to feel safe and feel that they don't need to cover at work. Now, hear me out. I've said on a number of lectures, and I stand in my truth on this. People oftentimes will say authenticity is the bringing of one's full self to work. On the contrary, my full self does not belong in anybody's workplace. Rather, it is the alignment of values that we as individuals hold and how we position those objectively to the values of our organization. Cultural humility forces us to better understand how we build cultural awareness by seeking to grow our own worldview, how we move along this circumplex from awareness to understanding, empathy, and ultimately action. The demonstration of cultural awareness is how we gain greater support and followership of people within our organization. When it's not present, it is truly a felt experience across the organization and can come into significant conflict with our approach to how we build and drive approaches to conscious inclusion. I mentioned that conscious inclusion is all about value centricity in everything that we do. So ask yourself, when I am developing a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, does it have space and real estate on the people and culture strategy of my organization? Do I see diversity built into the approach that we take to our corporate strategy? Am I able to tie a congruence of experience between my consumer experience and my employee experience? And do I ensure that all employees, whether through total rewards and benefits, our approach to acquisition or mobility, all feel that they have an equitable opportunity to succeed in our workplace? That values alignment is how we build conscious inclusion. Now, I would be remiss to walk away by simply highlighting to you some of the barriers or challenges to conscious inclusion without leaving you with solutions. Similarly, there are 3 key ways that we can drive great impact. Number 1, Get over the fear of the unknown. Oftentimes, for many of us, we engage in silence. We choose not to say anything, particularly in the most challenging or traumatic experiences that we might face. But we have to stop viewing the approach to DE&I as only a movement from one trauma or tragedy to the next. We have to avoid the tendency to act with fear and avoid engaging in the conversation. As Simon Sinek has so rightly stated, the navigation of a difficult conversation has to be managed and owned by leaders. Because you lead from the front, you're first to the challenge, you're first to the opportunity. While your personal fear may incentivize you to not want to say anything, that silence can have such a significant impact on your organization and our ability to create inclusive cultures. Challenge that along the way, and inclusion can be built from there. Number 2, be ready to navigate the difficult conversation. Lack of awareness is but an excuse for folks who do not want to get into the dirty work of navigating the uncomfortability. The reality is, it was a lot of rather large structures and strictures like racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, nationalism, and so much more that got us to where we are today. It is those isms and phobias that have created the deeply polarized political perspectives that we see today and don't enable us to celebrate political diversity in the workplace. It is those same perspectives that lead to challenges with how we navigate the geopolitics of the day. And yet, if we rely on that lack of awareness or refuse to navigate the difficult conversation, we ultimately refuse to engage in deep conversations about conscious inclusion. We have to be proactive in our approach. This means being intentional. When we see or experience moments of bias or microaggressions as they exist in the workplace, get comfortable speaking up and calling them out. We have to do this at an individual level by thinking with a growth mindset, and at an interpersonal level by supporting others and using our voice when the most marginalized amongst us is seemingly unable to do so. And last but not least, go on your own journey of cultural humility and cultural awareness. Proudly declare, I don't know it all. I don't have 100% of all the answers, but I'm committed to learning more, navigating the conversation, and engaging with community. You see, over the last several weeks, for example, as we've had to navigate the deep complexities connected with the ensuing war between Israel and Hamas, I do not identify as Jewish, Muslim, Middle Eastern, Palestinian, Israeli, or otherwise. I don't have the full historical context despite work that I did in coursework in undergrad. As a result, I won't always say the right words. My actions won't always be aligned, and yet I ask folks to assume positive intent and view that well-intentioned nature within the lens of cultural humility and the centering of humanity. By doing this, I'm able to show people that while I don't have all the answers, I can proudly say what I don't know. I can highlight where uncertainty exists, but a commitment that as a leader who is committed to thriving in this space and creating actionable outcomes for all, I will do the work to be better and engage differently. When we do this, cultural awareness and cultural humility drives us ever forward to have the biggest amount of impact organizationally and for people and teams. Throughout our time together over the course of the 6 weeks, if you choose to join us for the certificate program, we'll give you deep exposure to many topics just like what we discussed today and more. We'll do a number of synchronous sessions where you'll hear from me and many lectures just like this, where we'll equip you not just with an understanding of the theory of the business case for diversity, the theories of how to drive conscious inclusion, but some tangible actions that you can build into effective action plans to start deploying as soon as tomorrow to be able to create great impact within our organizations. Because the reality is, simply bringing diverse voices and diverse faces to the table is not enough. We have to be sources of inspiration, innovation, and empowerment, where people feel that the connected realities of their experience are not just rooted in the membership of marginalization to which they hold, but rather is a part of a macro commitment on behalf of our organizations and institutions to breed visibility, transparency, and accountability. I hope to see you in the course soon. With that, I'm happy to hand it back to Allison for some additional context and details about our course, as well as to answer any questions that you might have for me.
Thank you so much, Jarvis. This was incredible. Every single time I learn something new from you, and something I appreciate so much is that you always bring fresh content to every single one of these master classes and to the synchronous sessions as well. So I hope that everyone here is as excited to continue their learning journey with you as I always am. And so I am about to share a little bit more about how you can continue to learn from Jarvis about these incredibly important strategies to help make your organization more equitable, diverse, and inclusive. And I also want to give one more push for sending in your questions as you have them. So if you have any question about any of the material that Jarvis presented, or any questions about the program as we go over the details, please put them in the bottom bar of Zoom. You'll find a Q&A button. Click on the Q&A button and type in and submit your questions there. And we'll start getting to Q&A right after I tell you just a little bit about the program. So Jarvis has done a really incredible job already outlining why diversity and equity and inclusion matters so much, but the numbers still tell such an incredibly powerful story. On basically every measurement, organizations that are more diverse, equitable, and inclusive perform better. In terms of profitability, more diverse companies have been found to be 33% more profitable. Companies with the highest DEI scores have an 80% higher ability to adapt to change. And we know in this era of AI and disruption that the ability to adapt to change has really never been so crucial to stay relevant, both at an individual and an organizational level. And in addition, professionals who work for inclusive organizations report being 3 times happier, which impacts both engagement and retention. However, and this is the big but, 63 to 80% of employees say change is happening too slowly, and only 5% of organizations hold executives accountable for racial and ethnic diversity in promotions. The number was actually very similar for women as well. So this shows that there is a big gap between what we need and what we're currently doing. And this program aims to fill that gap. We have a couple of specific target audiences in mind for this program. The first are organizational leaders who are creating more inclusive and diverse teams and organizations. The second is HR and DEI professionals who are developing and implementing the solutions, especially those of you who are in the middle of the messiness of what it looks like to actually make change happen in an organization. And then lastly, if you are here today, that means you've already demonstrated commitment to making your sphere of influence, whether it's a whole organization, a whole industry, or a team or a person, feel more included and more belonged. And so we want to be your champion in helping you to build the confidence, the resources, the skills to do that. The program is fully online. It is a 6-week program that requires about 3 hours of work per week that you manage on your own time. So it's meant to be incredibly flexible, fit in with your busy schedule. And in addition, there are 3 1.5-hour synchronous sessions that are about every other week in the program. They'll take place on Thursdays, February 29th, March 14th, and April 4th from 5 to 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. And so it's this really nice blend between being flexible and accommodating and you being able to do things on your own time and having the ability to connect interpersonally with both Jarvis and your fellow classmates and be able to work on things in real time. The asynchronous work is also highly interactive. I think sometimes when people hear asynchronous, they think they're going to be completely on their own. On every single page, there's the ability to interact with the content and with one another. So it is a really highly engaging course. The curriculum is broken into 6 modules, 1 module per week. The first is on understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion, where you'll analyze the benefits and challenges to achieving diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Secondly, you'll examine cultural competency and inclusive communication to develop effective cross-cultural communication to promote inclusion. Thirdly, you'll learn how to recognize, mitigate, and interrupt unconscious bias. Fourthly, you'll learn how to manage diversity and conflict to create a culture of collaboration. In Module 5, you'll learn how to promote structural equity, that's one of my favorite units because I think so often in these types of trainings, we focus on the self and the interpersonal dynamics, which are both crucial and are both elements of this curriculum, but we often stop there And so often the actual barriers to equity inclusion are structural, are in the policies, the promotional standards, things like that. And this program addresses that layer as well. And then lastly, you'll learn the skills to lead for diversity and inclusion from where you are. So you'll identify your sphere of influence, and you'll actually draft a plan for how you're going to use your sphere of influence in order to increase the equity, diversity, and inclusion within it. By the end of the course, these are the outcomes we commit to you. First, you'll develop effective diversity and inclusion initiatives by setting clear goals, creating an action plan, and tracking measurable success. We're all about the data and metrics here. Secondly, you'll improve communication and collaboration across diverse teams by fostering an environment built on trust and respect. Thirdly, you'll gain leadership skills to navigate the complexities of diversity-related challenges and effectively manage and resolve conflicts. Fourth, you'll learn to identify and dismantle structural inequalities within your organization that hinder progress. And lastly, you'll learn to promote a culture of continuous learning where curiosity thrives and new perspectives are embraced. So the learning won't just stop with you, but you'll learn how to infuse that within your team, your organization, your sphere of influence in order to make sure everyone is working towards the change together. If that sounds good and you would like to be a part of our next cohort, we would love for you to be a part of it. Then the enrollment deadline is February 22nd. We do fill up our seats on a first come, first served basis. So I would encourage you to register as soon as you're able to. And in addition, we are running an early bird promotional discount now through January 29th by using the promo code that is on the screen. It's basically winter DEI, but spelled a little without some of the vowels. And we will be sending out these slides afterwards, so no need to memorize this. And your next step would be to just complete a short enrollment form, and then you'll automatically be added to the class. So we hope that you choose to join us. Thank you for spending your lunch break, if you're on the East Coast time, with us today. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll go over to questions. And we would love to answer any questions you have, both around the topic that Jarvis presented on and also around the program. So thank you for being here today. Okay, the first question is for you, Jarvis. The question is, there's a mental health crisis going on. Can you speak about how CI can help employees in the workplace use conscious inclusion? At first, I didn't know what CI was. You spoke about how we act on the voice of the subconscious first. So how can we get people to think and act from a place of consciousness?
I really love this question. I think it's quite powerful. There's a few things. Organizations I saw make a significant amount of investment into mental health support and resources for people and teams very early into the pandemic. And yet I've started to see a lot of those resources significantly decline. In fact, a lot of organizations have sought to build it into the infrastructure of the org, but it's become so trite in a lot of ways where it's only things like employee assistance programming, which seems to be the only option that people are given. Or even more challenging is when we do provide additional mental health support, it doesn't consider it from like a full familial level. The reality is people are dealing with these experiences both internally and externally to the workplace. Real conscious inclusion forces us to consider empathy and grace in everything that we do. And yet the reality is mental health challenges is really one of the number one commonalities of experience that people hold across various different other demographic identities. For example, if we look at some of the research on covering, we find 45% of straight white males actually reported covering. And some of the top areas that they focused on covering was around their own mental health, alongside things like fatherhood and socioeconomic status. But mental health and well-being is one of the areas that, albeit how we identify through other dimensions or lenses of diversity, that we're all impacted by at a structural level that has to be talked about, navigated, and challenged. Now, the caveat that I'll add to that is when you overlay other intersectional identities, for example, being Black, being a Black woman with a disability alongside mental health, it undoubtedly amplifies the impact of what those mental health challenges or considerations are. What I highly encourage organizations to do is develop an entire work stream that is positioned specifically around how do we build mental health awareness in the workplace and then pair that with well-being programs. You'll notice that I feature those in two key areas by intention. Mental health awareness has to start with the reduction of the stigma associated with talking about mental health challenges at work. The unfortunate reality is that despite resources that have been provided and despite COVID-19 and the navigation of hybrid working spaces and the pandemic has created space and opportunity for us to navigate conversations around mental health more, we still are not engaging in it in the way that we should. What's more, a lot of workplaces are not owning the role that they play in contributing to people's deficiency in effective and productive mental health status. Burnout is a very real impact. And when we take a look at some of the modern research connected to burnout, the population that is most impacted by burnout at work are working mothers, because she's forced to navigate not only the stigma of potentially falling into the so-called mommy stereotype of trying to balance both work and life and people perceiving her commitment to her life as somehow showing a lack of commitment to the workplace. You pair that then with organizations not thinking about this through an equitable lens of the benefits that she needs to be able to support working environments and her family and her own well-being, you end up in an environment where stigma becomes the baseline for how any of these conversations are navigated. And so the mental health awareness journey has to start with stigma and the reduction of it to then build an empathetic focus on our leaders. Now, listen, we're not asking people to be less efficient. We're not asking people to be less productive. What we are asking for is our workplaces to recognize that our ways of working prior to March of 2020 have got to look different. I've heard far too many working environments say, here's what our return to pre-pandemic values or approaches will look like. Or you'll see this trend for organizations who have previously positioned their staff to be 100% remote, now demanding that workers come back. We're now seeing an imbalance between lives and lifestyles that people have set up coming into balance with literally their ability to keep their job, which undoubtedly impacts people's mental health because of things like economic insecurity that often comes with that, geographic insecurity if they have to move back to a region that is not necessarily accepting, for example, of their sexual identity or their racial identity. And so the challenge connected to mental health has to be a through line in everything that we do related to conscious inclusion, because it forces us to consider the playing field with which we all exist on and the baseline that we have to build to be able to create a level of competency around how we navigate it. Then, once we've examined the approach to destigmatization, empathy development, grace building, and finally equipping leaders with how to navigate some of these conversations, then we move into well-being programming, where we position some of the resources, skills, and opportunities for people to take advantage of. The big problem is so many organizations immediately went to well-being programs. Programmatic approaches are great, and yet they don't often scale. They are not rooted in systemic solutions, and they're seemingly impossible to measure because we haven't done the necessary work to get people comfortable with even taking advantage of those resources. Let's say, for example, organizations build benefits programs that allows people to take time away from work to go see a therapist on the company's dime. The reality is, if we have not created the level of destigmatization at the manager level, what then becomes the incentive for an individual contributor to want to take advantage of these resources without their manager seeing that they've leveraged this benefit, etc.? And so the kind of short answer to it is conscious inclusion and mental health and well-being in general have to be aligned and work in concert with each other for us to build healthy and productive organizations.
Thank you. That's an incredible answer. The next question is, many see DEI as mostly an HR issue, and that creates the idea that they don't need to get involved. Whereas the people who are most impacted, people of color and two-spirit LGBTQ plus people, are often pulled into dealing with uncomfortable conversations and put in the spotlight to share their point of view as their identity, which adds to their mental workload. What are your views on how to not get overwhelmed and address these situations? And I would also add and get other people engaged in the solution.
Yeah, so a few things, and Allison, if we can leave this question here,
Yeah.
because there's a number of pieces that I want to break
Yes.
down here. The first piece is dubbing it as an HR issue. Listen, HR plays a big role in a lot of the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. At the end of the day, they are cultural setters. In some ways, they are cultural stewards. They oftentimes manage the budget to support our DE&I work. One of the fatal flaws for an organization that is trying to build productive DE&I programs is to call it an HR issue. You are setting yourself up for absolute failure. Now, even if the organization exists within HR, it has to be navigating all of the different dimensions and components of an organization. Remember that question that I asked you during the lecture series, focused on, does your DEI strategy occupy real estate in the corporate strategy of the organization? This is an absolutely fundamental question that we have to ask, because HR organizations are often tasked with the people and culture attributes of it. But let's be super clear and candid in this conversation. There are functions in HR, like employee relations, that can at times feel very adversarial to the employee experience. It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to. And effective approaches where speak up culture and feedback mechanisms are put in place effectively, it doesn't have to be adversarial to one another. And yet that feeling is created. What's more is people often view HR functions in organizations as somehow opposed to the driving of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Again, the two do not have to be in diametric opposition to one another. The most leading organizations truly see DEI not as an issue at all, for starters, but rather as an opportunity. And then they certainly don't see it as something that has to only focus in HR, because the most leading organizations realize three things to be true. To get the greatest amount of business-focused and commercial benefit from DEI work in practice requires that we demonstrate congruence between our employee experience and our consumer experience. The most leading organizations tie their approach to DEI to brand and marketing, to product and innovation, and even to things that are done in other operating functions like finance. Throughout my experience and tenure at Nike, we made a lot of very strategic moves. For example, with our treasury department, we put some Nike capital into Black-owned banks. You see, Black-owned banks make loans for the starting of Black-owned small and medium businesses. By conditioning and giving opportunity for access to capital there, you're creating an ecosystem that oftentimes the federal government is not doing enough work on to ensure that communities have opportunities and access there. What's more is when we think about organizations that obsess diversity and things like product, is where you start to see more than just woke washing and rainbow washing during months like June for what communities are and what we represent. And rather, you start to actually see the essence of our identities come to life in things like footwear, apparel, equipment, etc., related to this. I think accessibility is a strong conversation here. When we think about organizations that are actually developing product for everybody, we need to consider, is this actually a product, for example, that someone with multiple sclerosis or cerebral palsy can effectively use? We oftentimes leave out communities with disabilities and oftentimes engage in, quite frankly, ableist language with how we navigate these conversations when we only position it as an HR issue, because then it becomes an exercise in compliance and not an exercise in innovation and development. So I want to address that part real quick. Next, when people of color and 2S LGBTQ plus communities are pulled into dealing with these uncomfortable conversations, we have to navigate the reality that, it is not our jobs directly. In these workplaces, oftentimes due to a lack of investment, support, etc., we often put the onus on the marginalized community to be able to navigate these conversations. Nothing is more challenging than to be able to than to be dealing with an issue externally to the workplace, coming to the workplace and trying to figure out how much you're going to cover to not have to deal with it, and then being put in a position where you're now having to explain to everybody why you feel the way you do, what impact it's causing, and then to have to develop a strategy for the organization to navigate or manage it for both consumers and other employees. This ecosystem, it feels destructive to the individual sitting in the chair, and also to then be disempowered when it comes to being able to manage or navigate more traditional business decisions in the organization. And so when we think about how people deal with some of these uncomfortable conversations and what it means to navigate them into workload, there's a few things that I would give advice on how not to feel overwhelmed. One, avoid the tendency to compartmentalize your own experiences. Oftentimes, as people of color, and we saw this happen a lot following the May 25th, 2020 murder of George Floyd, a lot of Black communities compartmentalized their approach. And they left the kind of pro-Black desire for liberation element of themselves at home to be accepted at work. When the reality is the emotional constraint and conditioning that they were feeling, it definitely showed up to work with it. And then as they're surrounded by people who are demonstrating microaggressive behavior or forcing them to navigate very difficult conversations, they were forced to feel that. So to avoid overwhelm, don't compartmentalize your experiences. Real psychological safety in the workplace means that I can bring the challenges and sadness that I feel when there is a shooting at the Pulse nightclub. I can bring the challenges and fears that I feel when there is a shooting at Club Q because I know that queer bars and LGBTQ plus spaces are safe havens for me. And yet, when I see people being attacked and killed in social environments that are important to me, I can't just leave that at home. I have to bring that to work. And believe it or not, it actually does reduce the overwhelm because it allows you to not have to create this emotional dysphoria where you're having to separate versions of yourself through the lens of advocacy-based identity covering to say, here's the version of me that's acceptable at work versus here's the version that's not. The second piece that I think you can do to avoid the overwhelm is make it super clear that while you identify as part of a particular group or population, the onus and accountability is not on you to be teacher and educator. And this is a very tough pill for our organizations to swallow, but I saw a lot of orgs learn from this following the murder of George Floyd when people finally created a bright line and said, yes, I am a Black employee. Yes, I am a Black leader, but it is not my job to explain to you how the impacts of enslavement, civil rights movement and anti-civil rights legislation, Jim Crow laws and policies, all the way to current state challenges with social determinants of health, lack of access to fair housing, gerrymandering, etc., impact my day-to-day experience. The reality is we live in a world where information is just flowing in such a enormous capacity that simply by doing a Google search, simply by redefining what we consume on Netflix or Hulu, simply by changing the books that we read or the magazines that we consume, you can educate yourself. And so the onus is not on me. And so you can avoid overwhelm by forcing that back on people who need to navigate it directly. In terms of how to address these situations, we often see many of these situations come to life through the lens of microaggressive behavior. Now, folks, microaggressions, very different than those very overt forms of racism, sexism, and homophobia. Microaggressions are these subtle, at times unintended impacts that align individuals to communities based on their membership of marginalization. Things like telling a Black person, you're so articulate. Things like telling a woman, you're so smart for a woman, or like, when will you have a baby? Things like telling a Latina woman, like, you're really pretty for a Latina woman. Things like telling an Asian identified person, wow, I can't believe you're not good at math. All of these are microaggressions that impact people's day-to-day experiences. They feel like little paper cuts. And for anybody that's had a paper cut, it sucks a lot in the moment. But it's even worse when you get that lemon juice, that lime juice, that onion juice in it. It becomes a constant reminder of that experience. That is what we have to navigate. And so I implore you to address microaggressions head on. Challenge the bias that's built within it, challenge people's assumptions that they make, and lead with a deliberateness and an intentionality around what your job or role is versus what is on the onus on the company and HR, quite frankly, to foster things like accountability in this space. To conclude this answer, though, referring to Allison's extension on the question, is what can others do? We all have to find ways to shepherd and steward the impact of allyship. Allyship is arguably one of the most overused words in the last 3 years, and people have not given a good definition of it. Here's what it is. It is a movement from simply being unaware or a bystander to experience, to actually actively acting in advocacy or activism in support of communities that are different than ourselves and that do not hold the same access to power and privilege as us. We all exist in some areas or spaces of power and privilege, and we all are impacted by some attribute of marginalization. We have to avoid seeing terms like white privilege or male privilege as dirty words and rather see the opportunity built within them. For example, as a cisgendered man, I hold a lot of privilege. There are countries that I have been to and navigated that I know if I took my sister or my mother to, they would not have the same sense or semblance of safety that I did. And so I rely on my male privilege to be an advocate and an activist for cis women, trans women, and non-binary communities, as well as anybody else who operates in a gender spectrum that is different than the presumed norm of a gender binary. Similarly, I have an MBA, I got it from Brown actually, and so as someone in possession of post-secondary education, I use that educational privilege to be an advocate and an ally for those that hold high school diplomas, GEDs, community college education, who may not get the same fair shake as the rest of the world in the pursuit of professional opportunities. The journey that we all have to go on is to recognize what privileges you hold, the power that that gives you, and how to leverage your mode as an ally to support and rebuild the experiences of others, both inside and outside of work.
Thank you so much. That is such an inspirational and tangible call to action, I think, to close on. But unfortunately, the time always flies by. But thank you so much, Jarvis, for these really specific, actionable, tangible strategies on the individual, interpersonal, and systemic level. I think that is your superpower, is making sure we're always holding all three levels at once. And I'm so appreciative that you delivered that in such a short amount of time today, as well as in your incredible Applied DEI Strategies Certificate. And thank all of you as well for joining us today. I know you're very busy too, and so I feel very appreciative that you have taken the time out of your day to learn this really crucial skill and to be that advocate and that ally and that champion to make your workplaces more diverse, equitable, and inclusion. We need all of you, and we hope that we can support you on every step of your journey. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye now.